Welcome to the Revolution of Man podcast. I'm your host, Lance Cashion. This is episode 32, recorded live at Texas Christian University during our Christian academic series that we host on campus. And this is recorded live, myself and Pastor Tyler Durham. And our topic for this episode is feminism destroying Western civilization? If you want to find out more about Revolution of Man and myself, go to Revolution of Man over on Substack. And don't forget to comment, like, and share this episode on your favorite podcasting platform. Enjoy episode 32 of the Revolution of Man podcast, recorded live at Texas Christian University. See ya.
So you picked an easy topic for us launching the spring semester. Is feminism destroying Western civilization?
Oh, so we to answer the question.
Yeah. So why did you pick? Why did you pick it? And is the answer yes or no?
The answer is yes, and you are dismissed. So yes. So I really wanted to discuss this because oftentimes when we talk about feminism, people have different definitions for what it means. Some people may take offense to that type. Is it destroying Western civilization? But we have to define what feminism is.
Right.
And what are the contours? How is it shaping us as Christians? I mean, we discussed this right before we started. You know, feminism shapes
everybody in this room.
Everybody has been shaped by feminism.
To some degree by feminism.
It's shaping our families, individuals, families, churches, communities, schools, nations, civilizations. So I think it's an important topic, and I wanted to tackle it, but the answer is yes.
So, and by the way, we don't put a script together before this. We don't even have an outline. We're both just starting from right here, this conversation.
Right.
If somebody came up to you and said, "What is feminism?" How would you begin to define that? I know it's a complex subject, right, but where would you begin?
I think it's a great question because defining terms is important in our cultural moment.
Yeah.
Like when you talk about feminism or justice or any of these terms, oftentimes you can be using the same words but different dictionaries, mm-hmm, and you can think you're in agreement with someone, but you're actually going in different directions.
Yeah.
So feminism, when I'm talking about feminism, I'm talking about a movement that began in the 1800s that then began to form and shape the culture that began really, I think, out of goodwill and, mm-hmm, and good intentions, where you had a male dominant society where in a negative sense, where women didn't have rights, women were subjugated, not treated as equals as the, mm-hmm, Bible would have us treat each other. And then there was a movement against that. Now, what ended up happening that happens to a lot of good movements, it gets co-opted. And then you have the Marxian type of framework comes in, the Enlightenment.
Marx. Good
old Marx. It all goes back to Marx, doesn't it? But then you have where it begins to move from, I think, a place of goodwill. I believe that, a place of goodwill and good intention, to where it gets completely co-opted. And then it becomes an expression of the Marxian worldview. Mm-hmm. And then it gets implemented where it divides everything within the power dynamic of oppressor and oppressed. And it just doesn't stop with men and women, driving that wedge between men and women and husbands and wives and all that it continues to drive the wedge down. And then you get these other movements because it just doesn't stop. That's where you eventually get to the LGBT movement, mm-hmm, and then the plus movements. And you have some feminism that would push back, that are like, there's a difference between biological males and females, and then the trans that has come and co-opted it would say there's no difference. Okay, so it's a train that's left the station. Some people want to get off, but it's moving. And then we have, as Christians, I think we have to understand it as how it drives these wedges, where ultimate liberation is liberation from the biological body. That's where it ends up.
So at the beginning, in the 19th century and even in the late 18th century,
right.
there was a a desire and an effort to bring about more equality between men and women in the United States. It's a constitutional republic, and many of these women, like a Susan B. Anthony or Frances Willard, even Hannah More in the late 18th century, who was a contemporary of William Wilberforce.
Right.
So they were fighting for equality. What's the difference between equality and equity? Because it kind of, what you were just saying is it evolved eventually to more fighting for equity. And we've talked about this before, but what's the difference between fighting for equality and fighting for equity? Whether it's a racial thing or a sexuality thing or a gender thing, what's the difference between those two?
Well, it goes back to first principles that biblically we're equals. We're all equal in value, worth, and actually status. And so before God's eyes, a man and woman, regardless of ethnicity or whatever, we're equal in God's eyes. But there are different areas of responsibility and giftings between different people.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's going to be a stratification of some people are more gifted or more naturally oriented to do certain things, to handle certain responsibilities.
And that's okay.
And that's fine. But
that's the way God kind of ordered things.
Right.
Yeah.
There's always a hierarchy. And that doesn't mean that some people are better. It means that you're equal, but you have some people that are more gifted and they're actually naturally, their natural abilities lead them in an area to be responsible for a specific area. Where equity comes in, again, it's a redefinition of the word, because God shows no partiality, and partiality is a sin. Where equity comes in is that says that everybody must be equal at the same level. And this is where social engineering comes in and starts to tinker with things in the economy and socially to be able to get equal outcomes.
Yeah. So I remember going to it was a church growth conference as a pastor. A group of us from our church went to this conference, and one of the speakers was Sheryl Sandberg, who used to work for Facebook, and she wrote like a best-selling book on Lean In. And it was a church conference that kind of melded leadership, principles and church ministry stuff. So that's why someone like Sheryl Sandberg was even there. But I'll never forget, she said, in a perfect world, there'd be 50% of the corporations in the U.S. would be led by men and 50% would be led by women. And that's the goal. And so regardless of 50% of women want to even pursue those roles, we're going to make sure that outcome becomes a reality. And so we're going to engineer that. We're going to put pressure on women to pursue certain fields in the university. We're going to incentivize women to pursue things that can bring about that outcome. That would be equity, as opposed to equality of, hey, we want equal rights for men and women. And if a woman wants to pursue this degree, she should have every, protection to do that. And if she qualifies, she qualifies. If she doesn't, she doesn't. But she needs an equal opportunity as opposed to the equal outcome. There's a big difference between those two.
Absolutely. And there's, I forget who said this, but forgive me. He said that all social engineering is preceded by verbal engineering. That you start changing what words mean before you actually start implementing them in theory. So the importance of an academic, institution like TCU or any others, that's where the ideas are formed and shaped, or the intellectuals, and then they filter down in the culture. So you have these intellectuals like Marx, Engels, Hegel, Rousseau, that think up these ideas, and they don't just stay in the academy and in the intellectual field. They filter their way down into the culture and start shaping culture. And here we are today as the ideas of Rousseau, Hegel, Kant, Marx all the way up through Simone de Beauvoir, Judith Butler, like all the way to this point now is how those ideas, ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. And I think there's been more victims of things like feminism in its current state where it is now than good that it's come from it.
So let's walk through that for a minute. So the 19th century, one author said that it was like a maternal feminism.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal was to highlight the strengths that women had and the differences between men and women, and promote opportunities for women to use those gifts and abilities to better society. And a lot of those gifts and abilities came out in certain areas of society, but especially in the home. So that's the maternal feminism. We're not trying to redefine what a female is. We're not trying to say that there's no difference between men and women. We're trying to lift up women and their strengths and abilities and allow them the opportunity to use that. And then what some people say is the second wave of feminism, which would have happened in like the late 1950s, early 1960s, especially with the abortion pill, the sexual revolution. This second wave of feminists really abandoned this idea of maternal feminism, and their focus was that whole idea of being a wife and a mother and raising a family, looking after the household, is a part of the oppressive system that men have put in place. They highlighted the oppressor-oppressed Marxist, categories. And then they said the goal is to break women free of this lie, this myth, that the goal in life for a woman is to start a family, to raise kids, and to be the one who builds a home. That was a big difference between the original quote unquote feminists and that second wave. And so, who are some of the key figures, or what are your thoughts on that second wave and how they?
Yeah, the second wave. Simone de Beauvoir, I think, she wrote a book called "The Second Sex," and people will recognize this quote. She said that one isn't born a woman, one becomes a woman. And what she's saying there is that your biological sex, she is untethering biological sex. And this is
from what it means to be a woman.
From what it means to be a woman. And then flowing from that, that's where you get the current definition of gender, right? So she untethers biological sex from what it means to be a woman, and then says that the social conditions are what tell you what a woman is. So the idea is that you have to create a revolution in the social conditions to reshape it so that a woman can be whatever the social conditions, and that's that the patriarchy, men are the oppressors, the system itself is the oppression. So you have to break through that system. So she's a key figure in that movement. There's others, Firestone and others that are key radical feminists that kind of open this door to this strange new world.
And that's such a big point, because you've got to separate what it means to be a woman from the biology, which is determined, defined. It's in God's natural order, and then once you untether it from that, then you can remake what it means to be a female, however you want to remake it. There's one quote from Simone de Beauvoir, or however you say it.
Simone de Beauvoir.
Yeah,
I'm not French, but
listen to this. This is from a book called Sex Matters, which I found really helpful. Her name is Mona Charon, and this is a quote from her book. What was it again? The second sex.
Second sex.
Let me find this real quick. This is what we're talking about with that second wave. Give me one second here. Here we go. She says, Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique, which was another radical feminist book, asked Simone whether women should have a choice between being homemakers and working full time. And here's what Simone says. She says, no woman should be authorized to stay at home to bring up her children. Society should be totally different. Women should not have that choice, precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make that one. So the idea is that we've got to awaken women to their, consciousness. Which is a very Marxist thing. And you don't know it, but you've been brainwashed to think that being married and having a family and raising up your kids is a good thing. That's just a lie that the men have given you to keep you in your place. You need to break free from that. And what's interesting about, the tell and what Simone's saying is, if you allow women to choose, and in this book, there's a lot of statistics that the vast majority of women, even those who work when they have children, would choose to either work part-time or take a break from work as they raise their children.
Right.
They're not compelled to do that. They're not forced to do that. They, by nature, desire to do that. The only way to change the culture is to prevent them from having that option. We've got to remove that option.
Because it's oppressive.
So let me ask you this. You've got a background in the financial world. Do you think that ideology shaped the economic structure of our culture to where so many families now have to have the mom and the dad work? Do you think that was strategic, or do you think that was accidental, just based on the economic condition we're in?
I think it's both, and it has to do with incentivizing things. So if you look at why one reason why feminism is destroying Western civilization is that what it has done is it has separated sex from marriage and sex and marriage from children. So it's driven a wedge. And then there's economic incentives to be a single mom. And what's interesting about how God shaped reality is that single moms still need some type of a father figure, provider for her growing family. Well, if the father's not around, fatherlessness is a major issue in the United States, and an economic issue as well. Then who becomes the father? The state. Then what does the state do? It must provide. Now, if she gets married, then the state removes those financial incentives, because now there's a provider. Mm-hmm. But what if that provision from that new father, that man, isn't enough to make up for what the state provides? Well, then it then closes that family off, and that's where you get generations that are caught up in the welfare state. Is that there's going to have to be a provider, and that works exactly into Marx's core, which is to dismantle the family.
Yeah,
I mean, at the core of all of this is the dismantling of family, is separating husbands from wives and children from the families, and making everyone dependents of the state. Because if that's where you're getting your food and your sustenance from, then that's who you're going to have allegiance to. Mm-hmm. And so it drives these wedges within all of these natural God-given relationships, and under the name of feminism and liberation. You must be liberated from the things that constrain you from being who you really are. And who you really are is not based on any ontological or biblical grounding. It's on who you feel. It becomes self-expressive individualism. I am, my identity is shaped by how I feel and what I want. And so back to the economic incentives, when you see the welfare state, there's billions of dollars that feed in and incentivize single moms raising children from maybe multiple fathers. And then the fathers don't have a role and a responsibility, so you've taken his dignity and obligations away from him, because with the obligation of providing as a father, you have the dignity of, I'm bringing home money, I'm providing for my family, and there's dignity in that. It doesn't matter if your means are meager or if you're wealthy. There's a dignity, and so it takes away the dignity from the man as well as the woman and the children.
Yeah.
and it's incentivized, so it costs back to
But,
the economy.
even middle class families, both parents are working.
That's right. Versus, 60, 70 years ago, that wasn't the case. A father could have a good job, well-paying job, have a vehicle, have a family and a home, and not all of these other constraints and needs to be able to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a lot more complicated.
Sure.
Now. We've got economists in the room who could probably explain it better than me, but culturally speaking, that's how it works out.
One of the things that the second wave feminists, that this Mona Charen critiqued the movement on, was that they took two major wrong turns. One was the rejection of the family, and two was essentially locking arms with the sexual revolution. And so, and strategically, it was a terrible move for women in the long run, is to say that one of the ways to be empowered as a female is to be sexually promiscuous, mm-hmm. to downplay the importance of monogamy and the importance of fidelity to your spouse, and actually kind of glamorizing the female that is in the hookup culture and sleeps with many men, and that's like a sign of female empowerment. And that's terrible.
That's a terrible.
It doesn't mean well for
victims. Back to victims of bad ideas, and I think that's where there's an economy of sex where, 50, 60 years ago, it was expected, let's say before the pill, which is probably a little longer than that. Before the technology of the pill, if you hooked up, outside of marriage, first of all, there was a cultural and a social negative attached to that. There were some consequences. Stigma, the taboos. And if you had a child from that, if there was a pregnancy from that relationship, then it was the man had to step in, mm-hmm. and then provide. Basically, you got to marry and consequences, to provide. But they're on that economy, is it made sex very expensive for a man. So it was like there were consequences. That means that you needed to behave in a certain way. You needed to believe certain things. You had to have your life together, and then pursue a woman, because she just wasn't going to just allow you to have sex with her. You bring in the pill, then it makes sex cheap. Mm-hmm. So then you've got more access. So there's not these hoops you have to jump through. You bring in pornography, then sex is very cheap. And then what ends up happening, men decide not to marry, women decide not to marry, and you have an implosion of birth rates and things like that, because sex is so cheap and it's meaningless. It's just something that you do for pleasure, not something that it was created for, which is to create life
within a marriage.
Yeah, if that makes sense.
So just for those who are listening and those who are here, just first wave feminism really was fighting for equality in this constitutional republic that we live in. Every human being should have the same rights and privileges as citizens of America. The 19th Amendment, right, and the women's suffrage movement, and a lot of positive things happened from that. Then it got co-opted by some radical Marxists. I mean, it's amazing how many of these women in that second wave feminism were outspoken Marxists. They adopted the Marxist framework of society that was originally, for Marx, was economic. You have the poor and the rich, and they just used the same principles and applied it to the genders, just like it's been applied in terms of sexuality and in the racial area. It's all about oppressor, and so they really latched onto that. And some of the ladies in that second wave, Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique, is probably the most famous work from them. Kate Millett, Sexual Politics. Germaine Greer, The Female Eunuch, and then what's her name? Shamilith Firestone, The Dialectic of Sex. Those are some key works, and if you read some of the some of the quotes from those books. I mean, it is hardcore.
So to Firestone. So she was a direct result, of Simone de Beauvoir, and she was a part of that. So she's a radical feminist that wrote The Dialectics of Sex, the case for feminist revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So here's
the Marxist side.
Marxist, yep. But she said, just as at the end of socialist revolution was not only the elimination of economic class privilege, but of the economic class distinction itself, so the end of the feminist revolution must be not just the elimination of male privilege, but of the sex distinction itself. Genital differences between human beings would no longer matter culturally.
And that was in that was the early 70s, I think.
Yes.
And she was already talking about pansexuality and
this is where you get, this leads to the whole trans thing. Yeah, the trans movement, because then it's the easiest way to see if Marxism is behind something is to see if there's a wedge and see if they divide people between, oppressors, oppressed, or people who have power and people who don't. Once you see that wedge driven, and then there's the revolution where one must fight the other, and
that's a philosophical thing. Like in the Marxist understanding of history and progress, it only comes through revolution and conflict. And so the only way to create a utopian society is to create conflict. Yeah. You have to pit people against each other if we want to see society continue to evolve and become better and better.
Toward the utopia, the ideal, where society
is completely flattened out. There's no distinction between anyone. It's all the same. And that's why you see in like communist countries, the architecture is hideous. There's no distinction between anything. It's all just dreary. It's gray. And that's the result of that ideology. But conflict is crucial.
Right. And it's that Hegelian dialectic of, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Like you have to have this conflict in order to get to the higher ideal, which then eventually you reach, the whole society reaches a consciousness that everyone's equal, and there's your utopia. You're basically
everything, and
the society is God.
Yeah, and the state disowns.
Right.
The government, there's no need for a government because we're all living perfectly in harmony.
Yes.
As
sharing everything that we have.
This one more thing on second wave feminism, and then I want to ask you about third wave. But to your point on what you just said, one of the ladies, her name's Atkinson, said that feminism is the theory, lesbianism is the practice. Feminism is the theory, lesbianism is the practice. Because if women are told from day one that men are the source of their discomfort, their pain, their grievances, men are the oppressors, well, eventually you're just going to avoid them. And that creates the only option is to pursue relationships with the same sex.
Yeah. And that's where that just tells you that it's not what you think it is. Most people think feminism, they think women's rights. That's not what these people are up to. They're up to something else.
And it's destroying
Western civilization.
No, it is, but mostly because it's destroying the dignity and distinction of the female human. God created man and woman, and we're to be complementary, and we're different. We're similar more so than we're different, but there are differences that should be celebrated and embraced and encouraged. There's strengths that women have that men don't have. There's weaknesses that women have that men don't have. And this ideology will lead to the destruction of the female in society. And we're seeing that with the bathrooms. There is no place where men can't.
Women's sports.
Yeah.
Perfect example. That's where this leads. And then men, because they've been castigated to the side and they want power, what do? Then they start behaving like women. So there's your counter.
I wanted to mention this to you too, because that's what I was thinking about this. And, guys like Nick Fuentes, I heard him on, I don't remember what podcast, but he was like, I don't want to get married. I don't really like women. I think they're all evil and corrupt. And he's like, I just want to do my own thing. I don't want to. He's literally, there's a movement among young men that is, I see a lot of similarities with this movement in the 1960s with women, which is that, the female it's grievance and victimhood for men. And it's leading them to not get married, to not have children, to not embrace the responsibilities that God's given men. And they're out there partying and having sex with multiple women and treating women like
or not
trash, or not having sex at all. The what do you call it? The incels.
Yeah.
Involuntary celibacy. So, right. Yeah. And it's the same ideology that's popping out on the other side.
It gets back to Marx. It's like you have, and conservatives fall into this. You start using the Marxian tools to fight back against the woke, and then you get this like, wait a second, you can't fight with the enemy's tools, because then you're still playing the same game. As Christian, we're in a different sport. If you continue to fight within that framework, the Marxian Hegelian dialectic, then you're just playing into their hand of the thesis.
And it's never ending.
It's never ending, and it just all ends in destruction.
I want to jump back on that, but I want to hear your thoughts. And another thing that came out of the feminist second wave movement is this quote: "The personal is political." And when you look at every one of these key women, these key books, their lives were not good, and they didn't end well. They either had terrible upbringings where they were abused by their father, or their father was absent, or their mother was a tyrant. Their marriages were terrible if they got married. The Firestone lady died alone. She went crazy, miserable, like
Nietzsche.
Like Nietzsche. The personal is political. Their personal experiences, they essentially imposed on every female. Like, because this is my experience, I'm going to turn this into a political agenda that reshapes the culture because of my grievances,
right,
with my personal experience. So the personal is political. I don't know, that I feel like that explains a lot of what's going on in our culture today.
Yeah. And if the personal is political, then what that's implying is that everything boils down to political power.
Well, first everything boils down to my feelings.
Right. And then your feelings shape then political power is all that there is, that there's nothing outside of politics.
No objective truth.
It eats up everything. Yeah. Objective truth. It's materialistic, that this world is all that there is, and so you have to fight for your piece of the pie.
Mm-hmm.
And that then becomes what's the most powerful thing in the world, that's boxed in the world, is often politics. That's where people fight, and that's where the power is, because it drives everything. Now, the Christian, we absolutely disagree with that, but for people that's their worldview, they're following the Marxian worldview, then of course politics is everything. So everything then becomes political, gaining for political power.
Okay, so third wave feminism essentially just latches on to all of these other crusades with the whole LGBTQ community, and they've essentially taken up all these other grievances. And that's why you get, I remember a few years ago, Martina Navratilova, who lived in Fort Worth when you and I were growing up, and that was in her prime as a tennis player. She was, a well-known lesbian, was in a same-sex marriage, I think, or at least relationship. And she comes out a few years ago against the transgender movement in sports and gets crucified by these leftists and other feminists. And same with J.K. Rowling.
Right. To affirm biological sex is now against the
radical feminists
of today.
The third wave feminism, yeah.
Which may be, some people call the waves are, we've talked about this, that the waves are one way to look at it. I mean, some would argue we're in a fourth wave. But this is where you get, it expands into diversity, intersectionality, and really the reproductive stuff starts to take off, you bring in the biomedical stuff to where now you can change your gender, you can inject hormones. So then it further disintegrates any distinctions. It just acts like acid, if that makes sense, on the culture, and it just works its way down and just eats up every distinction. But that's where you get like your Judith Butler, some of these other radical, gender feminists that,
and that's how you get like BLM leaders on the website. When the BLM, that the whole George Floyd thing, you go to the website, one of their goals, this is supposed to be about, racial reconciliation and the blacks in America, and yet one of their stated goals was the destruction of the traditional family.
Right.
So we've only got 5 minutes before Q&A time.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the remedy. What is the message? What is the Christian message to counter this ideology?
Well,
first, what do you think is destroying
destroying
Christian culture?
Yes. So I think the first thing is to define it, know what it is, that we're dealing. Feminism is an expression of a worldview. Okay, what is that worldview? Well, it's the Marxian worldview. It didn't begin like that, but it is. That's what we're dealing with today. Okay, what's the counter to that? Well, we have to understand how the worldview works. Okay, it has an origin story, meaning, morality, identity, destiny. It's trying to solve a problem. Marxism is trying to solve a problem. There's something wrong with the world. It offers a solution. We would agree that solution is destructive. So understanding that is also say, okay, what is Christian? So we have an origin story that is true. We have our identity given to us in Scripture by God. We are defined as male and female. We have specific roles and responsibilities, males and females, and then we have other
by
nature, and then also meaning that life does have meaning and purpose. That there's meaning to life, and that there's morality, means there's good and evil, not just it's socially constructed, that there is good and evil, there's objective truth, and then at the end there is something that comes after. It's not just
well, and a key point is the problem for any of these kind of Marxist movements, including feminism, is another human being or a system that's created by human beings, and those human beings are put in a category of oppressors. So
the family is oppressive. A mother is oppressive. A child in the womb is oppressing the mother.
So the problem is other people, whereas in the Christian worldview, the problem
is me.
Well, it's sin.
Yeah.
And it's we're at war not with other people, but with principalities and powers and ideologies, and our enemies are that world corrupt system, which is informed and motivated and driven by sin. And then our problem is our own sinful nature. And then the problem is, these principalities and powers, these ideas that are deceiving us and manipulating us and pulling us in. And so the remedy is not to look for someone to blame for my condition in life or some place to direct my grievances. That the remedy to the problem in the Christian worldview is to deal with the sin issue and reconcile with this God that you're out of step with. That's the thing that all of these different ideologies are pursuing can only be found through reconciliation with God in Jesus Christ.
Right.
And you look at the stats today. I don't have them in front of me. I've got them over here, but we don't have time. But overwhelmingly, women who pursue this feminist ideology that becomes their North Star are not happy.
I know
it's not promising it's not delivering on what it's promising.
And I know women that are in their late 40s and 50s who have believed this and are miserable. I can't have children. They're getting married later in life, and obviously they could adopt and things like that. But they be fruitful and multiply isn't in their future. Mm-hmm. And so when they start to realize that, they realize the lie But back to what you're talking about, we as Christians, we want people to ourselves included, we want to reorient people around four relationships: God, self, others, and creation. It's like, first of all, we have to understand who God is and what he's done for us through Jesus Christ. Then we can deal with the internal issues, repent, believe the gospel, and have our lives shaped by God's word in the community of church. Then we can reconcile and have relationships with others. And then with the rest of creation, we can see creation through a biblical lens. And then that's how we form and shape culture, or beginning at the marriage, family, church, community, all the way up. It has to begin with the individual and the relationship with God.
I agree. And so if I can only give one message to college students, it would be to reorient their priorities. The most important thing at this season of their life is to establish a relationship with Jesus Christ and grow in that relationship, and find a spouse and start a family.
Right. And then do all
and everything else.
God.
Everything else falls under that. But how many say that the most important thing right now is my career? Once I get all that handled, then I'll start working on my relationship with God, working on my finding a spouse. But I don't have time for that now. And it's actually our culture saying that's not important right now. I would say
I believe that. I believe that I needed to, go pursue a career, make some money, make sure I was good and stable, and then look.
A lot of parents have believed that. And a lot of parents are advising their children to put off marriage and family because you don't have enough in the bank account, or you need to get established in a career. And that's, I really believe that's not the biblical message.
What does God want for us? It's in Genesis 1 and 2.
The cultural mandate.
He wants us
be fruitful and multiply.
Be fruitful and multiply is the first part of that. Be fruitful and multiply. It means go find you a wife and be the kind of man that loves God, that a godly woman is going to be. I don't care, what his future holds, but he's a godly man, so I know that he's trustworthy, he's going to protect and provide, and then give me the freedom as a woman to pursue the God-given nature that he's already provided for me, bring flourishing and life into the home. And that is a good and godly and a glorious thing. Without it, the home is...
And for the pious and holy college students that say, I want to make sure that I'm mature enough before I get married and start a family, it's in the process of marriage and family that you are sanctified. Like my growth in maturity and my level of, servanthood to others has come through the process of working through my relationship with my wife and having kids and putting aside what I want to support them. That's not going to happen before. It's in the process of taking on these responsibilities that you begin to grow into who God's.
When others have a claim on you, like your wife and children, that's where it all begins. That's when the responsibility, you start to see it very clearly. They have a claim on you. Yep. Legitimate, you have obligations to them, and so that they can flourish.
Yep.
And that's the role of men, and that's where we need to go.
Are we ready? We're like 3 minutes over.
Okay.
I didn't want to cut you off because that was wonderful. So if this is your first time at the Christian Academic Series, we now take questions. And the way that you can do that anonymously, at least to our two pastors, is to email them to me right now. Take out your pocket idol, as Lance says, your phone, right? Go ahead and type your question, and I will ask it to them, time permitting, without sharing your name should you want to remain anonymous. And I have not received any yet.
Could they come up?
Or you just come up. Yeah, come on up.
Do that.
Does anybody have any questions? And we have a microphone here that points kind of that direction. So it'll pick
By
up.
the way, this is not fair for us to have to talk about feminism and the history of feminism and the theology in an hour. In 45 minutes, actually. So we just scratched the surface. So if you're frustrated on something we didn't talk about, would love to hear your questions right now.
Yes, sir.
I think one thing maybe that wasn't really brought out is who's the author of all the stuff that we've heard. It's Satan. Satan started way back, and let me read something, Genesis 3:16. And to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain and your conception, and in pain you shall bring forth children, and thy desire shall be for thy husband, and he shall rule over you. Satan went, I'll see to that. I'll flip this thing. And guess what he's done today? And you guys we're talking about it. He's flipped it. Yeah. These women have listened to him and said, you bet, we are better than he, and we're going to take over. I really think this is a spiritual warfare that's going on that maybe was not mentioned, that we need to understand. He is driving this, and it's not like I was born in a home when nobody had da-da-da-da-da-da, and we're given all that. That makes me who I am. Not really. It has to do with still he's driving this thing, and we need to watch out and listen to him.
I think it's a great point. And I think a community is the building blocks of a community start with the marriage and then the family. And if you can put a wedge between the husband and wife, sure, then that can really do damage in a society. And the remedy to that is a spiritual remedy. It's on the inside for each of the individuals, for each spouse. That's a great point.
Yeah.
To piggyback off what he said, I think that the enemy takes us to extremes. One extreme would be a pagan-style patriarchy, like Islamism. The woman is dominated and inferior, not equal to men in value. And then the opposite extreme would be a woman wanting to dominate a man and make them inferior and the root of all evil. Mm-hmm. Two extremes. Yep. So the whole complementarianism versus egalitarianism and the role of a woman, what is the biblical view of that? Let's take to either extreme and not the truth. The truth is great for women. The truth is great for men. And that's where I think the church has fallen short in explaining to this culture. And a lot of women are going the wrong direction because they hear one extreme or the other.
And great point. And like I said in the beginning, is that feminism has shaped even the church. It's shaped. There's feminist theology. There's actually feminist theology, which same thing with liberation theology. All these, when you put a word in front of theology, it's going to give you a framework. That's the framework in which you're working, and then that's where these things get broken out. And it's basically it's deconstructing biblical theology of what we believe the Bible says in the form and shape that our lives should take naturally, that God has given us, that should shape the church. He's given us the framework for how we should live and what human flourishing looks like. The problem is that we buy into what the culture says, and then we import that into our theology, and then it forms and shapes our ecclesiology, which is the structure of the church. So that's why I say we're all impacted by feminism. We are. And that's something that we should fight. That if we see it in ourselves, we see it in our churches and our families, we should say, wait a second, that's wrong. Let's point people to the truth and reorient ourselves around God's creational norms in the structure for life, because that is where you get human flourishing, where even pagans benefit from it. But what do you think?
No, that's good. That's good.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I think in modern evangelicalism, it seems like first wave feminism is mostly known for some of the positive things that came out of it. Mm-hmm. But there were definitely some bad things that came out of it that led to second wave, things like that.
Sure.
That being said, evangelicals tend to say things like, oh, I'm a first wave feminist, or I'm a biblical feminist, things like that. Pastorally, would you warn people against those types of identifications, just because it maybe muddies the water a little bit, or the way it can't just be known for for the positive things?
Yes. Ooh, go ahead.
That's a great point, and I think we did highlight the positives of that, but didn't highlight the fact that that second wave, if you want to use those terms, like Lance said, there's different, but it didn't just come out of nowhere. There were already seeds of this grievance and victimhood mentality at the very beginning. And that's with any good things that are happening in society. There's evil is right there at the doorstep. But one of the interesting things is a Pew Research Center in 2012. Actually, here it is, 2016 YouGov poll. Only 26% of Americans call themselves feminists, and the vast majority of people don't. That term is so loaded and has so much baggage, negative, that most people don't want to use it. I don't know why the church would start using that and try to, spin in the positive light. You don't need to use the term, in my opinion. So I would agree with you that I don't see any benefit of identifying yourself as I'm a feminist Christian.
Right.
Any adjective at the beginning of Christian, I'm just not a big fan of.
And it's interesting because I think one of the steps that Christians should take to kind of help develop that question and answer it is that we should recover biblical categories and biblical language. Several years ago, I decided to stop using the term races because it's not a biblical framework. It's not. There's one race, the human race, and there are tribes, tongues, ethnicities. That's where you get ethnos, nations, and peoples. That's biblical language. So there's multiple ethnicities and peoples, tribes, and tongues, but there is only one race. And yet, that was hard for me to get through my head and start using biblical categories and biblical terminology. But I think back to all social engineering is preceded by verbal engineering, is that, quite frankly, Christians should be the best verbal engineers on the planet. We should begin using biblical language. The word gender, it is a social construct. Back to John Money, go look him up. That we shouldn't be using gender. And
too often we fight with the enemy's categories instead of reclaiming
and it's so I think if we can recover the language, the biblical language and biblical categories, that's going to be a huge step into forming and shaping the type of families, communities, and cultures that Christians want and bring human flourishing to their environment.
So why do Christians and pastors so easily do that? Like they'll claim little bits of feminism. Is there like a currency there that
I think it's just the principle that a lot of pastors have adopted coming out of the church growth and seeker-sensitive movement of cultural accommodation. And really that's dated back since the beginning of the church. Is there's a temptation to try to become like the culture to win the culture. And so we want to show that we're not like those right-wing Christians. And so we're going to use the terminology that, we're going to win them by using their language and behaving in some ways like them. And that strategy has not worked.
Right. Because then you lose the distinction, because the distinction of the church is attractive because it's distinct from the culture. You should look at the church and see that there is a difference, that there is something there that is completely different than anything else in the world. And it's in the distinctions and our unity as the church as Christians, but the distinctions of the local church that make it attractive for people, because you're seeing a body of people grounded and hearing from God's word and the truth in community from all kinds of different backgrounds.
Well, there was a prominent pastor who had a very famous person in the media world start attending his church and claim to have come to Christ, and was just talking about how great the church was and the pastor was. But as she started getting involved in the church and went through the membership class and got into a Bible study, she realized that what was said in the pulpit was very different than what they actually believed. And so she, was very disillusioned by that and left the church and was now a pretty militant opponent of that church. But that's if you win people by speaking like they do, but you don't believe it, what you win them with is what you win them to. So if that's not who you are, then it's really not accomplishing anything.
It's actually
use that language.
Against,
because eventually they're going to find out what you really believe.
Right.
You guys briefly mentioned that young men are starting to hate women. Kind of separating, going to abstinence. I think I can kind of give some insight on that. not including the hookup culture, which is definitely a contributing factor.
Sure.
The Me Too movement. We kind of grew up during the Me Too movement, and I think if you ask any men at this university who's a student here, they know someone who was personally affected by a false accusation.
Right.
And we saw that those false accusers never received any punishment, any kind of retribution for their actions. Right. So I think that's kind of why young men are going in that direction, staying away from it.
That's a great point, because it's back to incentives, disincentivizing young men to pursue women because there's a fear and there's a stigma there, and then some women will use that as power over men, and then that's going to push good men away. So then it just, again,
You can see why we would say this ideology has done so much damage in our culture, how it's, put a wedge between men and women all the way down to the, high schools and colleges. And it's just, the church has got to speak into that and be the voice of clarity and start promoting young people finding other godly men and women and getting married and not being so jaded and cynical that you give up on it, but to press through and to be obedient to what God's called them to do. And there's so much joy and satisfaction that comes with pursuing the things that God has put before us, so the church has got to just continue to speak into that boldly, and a lot of churches aren't willing to do that, especially with the topic of feminism. They might talk about other things, maybe even the pro-life stuff, but to start talking about the differences between men and women, that's, for a lot of churches, they're not willing to do that.
Yeah. All right.
Any other questions?
I'm
We'll end right here.
You're not totally clear on what the current agenda would be of feminism. And you talked about utopia, but in the big goal, what is?
I think it's what Lance said a while ago. I think it's power, and I think it's and that's why they've latched on to any group that's a part of the oppressed group. They're going to lock arms with, even if there's a contradiction. Like, it makes no sense to me to be a feminist and be pro-transgender. I don't understand that, other than if they work together, they can overthrow the status quo. And then once the status quo is overthrown, well, what happens next? They turn on each other, and then the conflict continues, because those two ideologies are irreconcilable.
Yeah, the LG and the B are at direct odds with the T. But
bisexuality, you can choose, I like men and women, and it's like, well, but
but you're affirming biological sex versus the trans doesn't affirm that, so they're ideologically.
Well, but also with homosexuality, it's like you're born this way, you can't change it. Bisexuality, it's like, well, I can choose either one.
Those
are contradictory. Yeah. So it's and this is another Marxist thing in the Russian Revolution in 1917. You had all kinds of socialist groups that worked together, communist groups that didn't like each other, but they worked together. And then once the power vacuum was created, then it's the survival of the fittest. And it was Lenin and his Bolsheviks, which were actually the minority. Bolsheviks is Russian for majority, but they were the minority using the language.
Right.
Yeah. But they won. And what do they do with their supposed friends? They line them up and eliminate them. So yeah, it's power, and it's not going to end well as once they start turning on each other.
No, we're old enough to remember maybe the first blush of feminism in the 70s. I think Helen Reddy had a song called "I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar."
Right.
And then along came the other catchphrase was, "You've come a long way, babe."
It's coming. It has come a long way.
And you think about Lady Gaga's 2012 album, "Born This Way." That's where it all ends. I mean, it ends up in. It is about power, but it ends up destroying the cultural fabric where everything is very just loosely held, and there's no cohesion whatsoever. And when a culture is destroyed, then everything else follows, and we end up in a bad way as a society. We good? Grant,
You want to end it on that?
let's end it on that.